talking with people about how to have a great retirement. This is the Rock Your Retirement Show. We don't talk about money, but we talk about almost everything else you need to rock your retirement. Now, here's your host, Kathy Klein.
We have a treat for you today. It's not just Barb and me, but we have another guest. And how this guest came around is Barbara was reading this book called Are We Old Yet? A casual conversation about aging. And she said, let's have the author, Garry Cole, come on the show. And so that's what we're doing. Garry, welcome to the show. And Barbara, it's good to see you again.
Hi, Kathy.
And hi, Kathy. Hi, Barbara. Nice to meet you both. And thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the book, the little 30-second version, and why you wrote it.
I have to say, your show is so relevant to all of us baby boomers who are retiring now. And I consider myself semi-retired. And so with that extra time, I was able to write the book. The book is really about aging well and how can I make the most of my retirement, right? So I did 2 years worth of research and I wrote the book. The book is called, as you said, Are We Old Yet? It has 35 chapters that I call conversations, and it covers a lot of different topics, everything from the science of aging, why we get old, our telomeres shorten, our senescent cells grows, and our mitochondria goes wacko. So the 14 hallmarks of aging, I write about it. I write about the fountain of youth and what's the process of the fountain of youth, because it's not a place, it's a process. So I write about that. And I talk about life transitions, when you're older, our empty nest, and I talk about retirement and what's the best way to deal with that. It's all really about an optimistic outlook of getting older.
Well, thank you for that. And Barbara, I know that you had some topics that were in the book that you found really interesting. Why don't you talk to the listener about that?
Sure. And I think for the listener, this is a type of book that you can just pick up and put down. And there's not a lot of books you can do that when they're fiction, but it is, like he said, conversations. And so some of them may be relevant to you. Some of them will make you emotional like they did me. And some of them will be just like, oh, wow, that just really hits home.
Does that remind you of when this show first started? And yes. I said, this show's like an encyclopedia. Garry, this show's been around since 2016 and it's gone through a lot of changes. So it's kind of like the beginning of the show where it's like a little encyclopedia.
Right. When I joined in 2020, I was just looking at retirement. I was working in a planning department and I love a good to-do list. And so your chapter, Conversation 8, the to-do list, really resonated with me. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Garry.
Yes, that was one of the early chapters that I wrote because when I retired, well, first of all, I've always run my life with a to-do list. If it needed to get done, I had to do a to-do list. But when I retired, I said, maybe I don't need a list. Maybe I just don't. Well, as you well know, when you retire, you still have things to do. So the idea of not having a list was actually very exciting to me, but it failed miserably because I still have things to do. I still have a life to live, and retirement's just a different life. So I went back to to-do list. I love checking things off. And actually the book became part of my to-do list because I added this little section called the Power Corner. And that Power Corner had all the hopes and dreams and things that I want to do in the future. And the book started down there and it went from there. So yeah, my to-do list is still being done every Sunday night. I look at my week and I write out my to-do list and it works for me.
Okay, so I want to interject here. Give us some examples of what would be on your to-do list, Garry.
Well, as I wrote in the book, it used to be all about my kids and my work. What did I need to do for them? Because that's how life was. Friday night football game, Saturday all day gymnastics meet. And of course, at work, there was this project or that project. So the thing that was different in the new to-do list, it was more me focused because my kids have grown and flown, living their best life in New York and Chicago.
So give us an example of what your to-do list would look like. Let's say this last Sunday's to-do list. Tell us what it looks like.
So I can't say it verbatim, but a lot still wraps around the book. I'm doing speaking engagements. I'm writing blogs. I'm preparing for podcasts. So a lot of my to-do list talks about the research and writing about aging process. And I'm still semi-retired, so I have some of those work type things I have to do. And then I have a few family obligations. My wife and I are going to dinner with friends tonight. So on the to-do list is dinner with the Sloans at 6:00.
Okay, great. Is there bring a bottle of wine on that to-do list or just show up?
It is at a very nice restaurant. There will be a lot of wine, but we will not be bringing it.
Oh, even better. Restaurants are so nice. Okay, well, thank you for explaining that.
So before we pivot away from the to-do list, and the next chapter that really resonated with me is related to it, I think what Garry has shown is that by having a plan, having a goal, speaking it verbally, writing it down, you're halfway there to accomplishing it. And I've observed that it's easy to get in really bad habits in retirement because I can do it tomorrow. I can do it next week. I could never do it. And it's easy to get kind of stuck. Whereas if you go to bed at night and say, I know exactly what I'm going to do tomorrow, and I've got a to-do list. Garry's a prime example of the motivation of setting goals. You don't have to set a goal. You could set a goal to say, I'm just going to read a book out in the yard. But having those goals gets you further along to accomplishing things that are important to you and that you value. So I appreciated that chapter a lot, Garry.
Thank you, Art. And that's exactly why I still have my to-do list.
So we'll pivot now to conversation number 10. Who am I now? And I'll be honest, the reason that resonated with me is because I was in county government for 44 years, and my identity was tied up with that, and a mom and all those things. But I have to say, when I retired, and Kathy remembers, it was kind of jarring. Like, who am I now? How do I need to dress? What kind of car do I need? Because everything had shifted. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about conversation number 10, who am I now?
Yes, Barbara, that's exactly what most people go through when they retire. Our identity as we age tends to change over time. And we tend to ask ourselves, who am I now? And for me and many others, retirement provides a double whammy because, as you mentioned, our career is often tied up in our identity, as is raising our children. And for me, I was losing both of those at the same time. So it was that double whammy. So I tell a story in the book about a phone call I received, and someone was calling me to sell me internet service for my business. I had no interest in talking to that person. So I said, I'm retired. He hung up in the middle of my word, I'm retired, because he had no interest in me using the R word, or retirement. And I was happy, but I was sad. I was happy because I didn't waste my time with an internet salesperson, but I was kind of sad because as I used the R word, it almost looked as if it had no value anymore. And it lets me now say to myself, if someone asks me, so what do you do? Is my answer to say I'm retired, because it's not even an accurate answer, because when you think about it, retired doesn't tell you what you do. It tells you what you don't do. I don't work in the same 40-hour work week anymore. So really, using the word retirement to describe what we do is not accurate. So this isn't the first time we've faced this identity crisis. When you think about it, though, we graduated from high school. We ask ourselves, who am I now? And then early career, our evolving identity. And then our later career, of course, we have to go through a midlife crisis, and that's all about the identity. And then when we retire, we ask ourselves, we've come back full circle, we ask ourselves, now what? Now who am I? So last year, I had an eye-opening experience. I attended my daughter's college graduation from Michigan State University. And the commencement speakers shared great thoughts of our future and setting goals and respecting ourselves and getting ready for that next phase in life. And as I sat there, I felt to myself, is this message for me? And I almost felt guilty because I felt like I was stealing a message that was clearly meant for the graduates. Later that night, I was thinking about a metaphor that maybe retirement is like graduating from the best university in the world, the university of life, so to speak. And like they said at the commencement ceremony, graduating isn't the end, it's just a new beginning. And that's kind of how I feel about retirement now. It's not the end, it's really a new beginning. And in the book, I end that chapter and I say, I always like a song when I'm going through a big thing in my life. So is your song going to be the Eagles' Take It Easy? Or is it going to be Frank Sinatra, The Best Is Yet to Come? And for me, I'm a big Frank Sinatra fan, but to each their own. And I think that as we retired, for sure, our identity is going to change with it.
So, Garry, I loved what you said about kind of answering the question of who am I now? And I think when you're talking about, graduating from college, it represents a new beginning that's limitless. And as I've joined into this retirement journey, it kind of feels the same way. It's a little scary because you're really not sure what you want to do, but it is an opportunity to reinvent yourself, so to speak. Generally speaking, people have resources. There are those that don't, but some people have a home. They're a little more financially secure than they were in college. They're more open to new experiences because they were raising kids and now it's time to do something more fun, or they're also open to volunteering. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about the emotion that's tied to that. Who am I? How have you been feeling as you've been approaching it? I know you wrote the book and that was probably a good outlet, but when you get down to the heart of the matter, kind of where are you at with yourself, your relationships with your wife or your children? Because it is a big change to go from working to being this new chapter in your life.
Yes, that's a great question. And everything does change when you go into this new phase in our life and you're not tied and you're not working, and that's not part of your goal and your purpose in life. And it is strong. Let me talk about purpose in life, because as I think about who am I now, I think a very, very important part of our identity is the reason to wake up in the morning and a purpose in life. And what are we going to do? What are we going to strive for in that day? And so I did write another chapter in the book that is sort of so symbiotic to this one, because it's almost like two sides of the same coin, because our purpose in life also changes as we go through life. I know for me, my purpose in life for many, many years was career-based, and can I do better? Can I do a better job? Can I grow in my life? And then when I have children, my purpose in life really pivoted and focused on them. And, my purpose in life is still always going to be to love my children, but taking care of them is much different now. I played golf with an 83-year-old retired Air Force colonel last week. And he asked me, we talked about the book, and he asked me, what are the three most important things that you identified to have a long, happy, healthy life? And I said, the first one is just to be healthy, that whole eat well, sleep well, and exercise. And the second thing is to have a good social life. And the third thing I said was to have a purpose in life. And that really resonated with him. He said, oh, that's exactly what my wife and I do. We always wake up and say, what is it we want to accomplish today? As I was writing the book, I asked my wife, she was walking out one day, and I said, hey, do you have a purpose in life? And very quickly she said, I do. I like to wear cute clothes and make a difference in my day. And she was very successful that day. She looked very cute walking out, as she does every day. And she likes to make just a small little change in people's lives and make them feel better. So yeah, having a purpose is a great big part of finding yourself after retirement.
Well, Garry, you touched on a couple things that I know there was a chapter on the blue zones. And recently, Kathy and I have been talking about the blue zones, not just the eating healthy and things in moderation, but kind of the foundation for it, which is building community, building connection, having the right tribe, being with people that have similar habits that are good habits. And so I appreciated that you included that in your book. That whole idea of, and we talked about it, I think last time, it's called ikigai, where it is, why do you get up in the morning? What are you good at? What do you love? I think what's happened for you is that you obviously like to complete things, right? Everybody could say, I want to write a book, and everybody could start a book. But one of your purposes is to complete the tasks that are set out ahead of you, which I really envy, because I think I get so distracted. I'm like, okay, I'm on to the next thing. And so I appreciate what you're saying about having a purpose. I think for some listeners, and I have struggled with it, right after retirement, what is my purpose? How has it changed? And it can be kind of difficult, because if someone were to ask me my purpose 6 months ago, it was survive cancer.
Right.
Right? You survive cancer. I just want to survive. I want to see my grandkids grow up. Just this week, I found my purpose in that we're in a new community. And as a new neighbor, there wasn't anyone that knocked on my door and said, welcome to the community. So I started doing it. Well, now I found 8 followers. And so we're going to be kicking off a project to figure out what is a relevant, inexpensive way to welcome neighbors in our new community. We have 400 more houses coming.
Wow.
And that's a project, but I really feel called to do it. So now that the book's completed, and now that you are, going on tour and all of that, when all that's done, and that may be months or weeks away, what are you feeling called to be doing on the next chapter after the book?
Barbara, you said it so well. Things can change in your life, which in fact changes your purpose. And for you, health became a major purpose. And for me, when I retired and my kids moved away, 2 things that really dominated my purpose for 40 years probably. I was looking for that next purpose. And I've always been a curious person who likes to learn. I'm always a person that likes to always do my best. So what was topical for me at this point in time was aging. Aging became a very important element to me. Retirement and just aging in general. And so I really said to myself, I want to learn everything I can about aging. And so that's what I did. And that's what I continue to do. And then I love to, in fact, share it with others through the book, through the blog, podcast, and speaking. So that's really been my purpose in life, and sort of that repurpose, if you will.
I have a question for you, Garry. Have you read the book Young Forever by Mark Hyman?
I have not. However, I listen to his podcast all the time. Listen to it today.
Oh, you do? So I don't think we've spoken about his book, have we, Barb?
No.
So I've been really on a kick lately about health and longevity. And, I've been diagnosed with osteoporosis. And so I've been reading a lot of health books. And he's really into some what I used to consider woo-woo stuff. And it's all focused on your gut. And so we might be talking about that later in different episodes, Barbara, but Young Forever I read another book called Prime, which was written back in 2016 by a neurologist in San Diego, believe it or not, where I'm from. One of my clients recommended the book. So it's a weight loss book, sort of. I don't need to lose any weight, but she said, Kathy, you should read this book. You're reading books on longevity and health, and this is really good. Talking about longevity, I'm fascinated with Mark Hyman, MD. He's also an MD, about the things that he has to say as well. So thank you both for bringing that up.
Let me mention Mark Hyman. He is what he calls himself a functional medicine doctor. And it sort of looks at the body as a whole. And I love what he says, because he talks about how do you sleep and how do you eat, and you need to exercise. And it's not just the medicine that you put in your body. There's so many things that you can do to affect your health. By the way, the number 1 selling longevity book that you may want to pick up is called Outlive by Peter Attia. I don't know if you've seen that or heard that or read that. I am finishing that right now. Very biology focused, but it's a great book called Outlive by Peter Attia. So just a thought.
Well, let's get back to your book, since that's what we're here for. But I know that Kathy will put some of these references into the show notes for listeners who, want to link to them. But I think if we're on the topic of a long and happy life, one of the things that this show has is 6 pillars. And I think if you've heard the show, you know what they are. But you had in Conversation 28, 10 pillars to living a happy, healthy, and long life. And we don't need to go through all the 10 pillars. I think we've, in some respects, touched on, for sure, living as healthy as possible, which is through diet and exercise and that. We already talked about live with purpose. But maybe you could just pick a few of the other pillars, not all 10. But I thought they were just a really good summation of, okay, if you're going to live a long life, these are the things you want to do.
Barb, that was one of my deepest research chapters I wrote. And after I wrote it, I used AI to validate what I wrote. I wanted to make sure what I was going to tell people and stand up and say, hey, these are the things you should do to live a happy, healthy, and long life. And I feel very comfortable that it did, in fact, validate me. And you've mentioned a couple of the pillars now. And let me mention something that takes some people back a little bit and say, really, that's all I need to do? And that is relationships. The Blue Zones talk about it in their Power of 9. There's also a book that talks about the 84-year Harvard study that goes back from 1938 and says, what is the single most important thing that you can do to live a happy, healthy life? It is, in fact, relationships. And so I talk about that in the book in a couple different places. And that was one that might surprise some, but is very, very important. Another one that I really, really enjoyed is your attitude about aging. Being optimistic about aging actually medically can increase your lifespan from 7 to 11 years. I talk in that chapter about my wife, who she and I think about aging differently, and we think about optimism differently, which is a great discussion because not everybody thinks about aging like I do. Not everybody wants to live to be 100 years old like I do. So I recognize that, and she keeps me honest in that way. But I have to quote Winston Churchill in The Optimism. He says, a pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. And that's kind of how I approach the aging process. It's like, this is just one more difficulty that I'm going to find an opportunity. So those were a couple things that I really, really think are important in those 10 pillars. And yes, I did read your 6, and they were wonderful.
Well, I couldn't agree more. But just to take the counter approach, I totally agree about relationships and optimism. But we've been talking a lot in my spiritual encouragement group, a group of ladies here, about the epidemic of loneliness, the epidemic of social isolation, and the health impact that has. And we've talked about that before on the show. And so it's easy to say, get your relationship game going and be optimistic. But some of the women were sharing how devastated they are at relationships that have been broken, that there has been disagreement, maybe politically, a family argument, and there is a lot of estrangement of parents and children and different people, which is just mind-blowing to me. But I'm coming upon it. And so in your research, in your study, do you have any suggestions or hope? Because if a relationship's broken, but you're still alive, then I imagine there's an opportunity for restoration. Maybe just talk about, if you were in that situation, which I don't think you are, but if you were, what steps would you take to get your relationship game going and so that you could be optimistic? Because I think the opposite happens when relationships break.
You're absolutely right. Matter of fact, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, last year suggested that in America, loneliness is an epidemic. It's not just a problem that we have. It's absolutely an epidemic that needs to be addressed. It's interesting you focused on women and breaking and having problems with relationships. I actually have a chapter in the book called Guys Without Friends. guys without friends, and we have a different problem than women have. We just don't go out and get friends. And I do talk about a number of different ways that we can do it. But when a woman, when anybody for that matter, breaks a friendship because of something that happens, and I've seen it happen. I don't know that I have a good answer for it. I'm going to give an answer. I'm going to give you one because you asked, but I don't know if it's a good one. But to me, it's just swallow your pride and say, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm sorry that our relationship broke down at this point in time. The reason isn't even important. Our friendship is more important, and let's just make friends. Let's just be friends again. My wife and I are binging Sex and the City right now. There's a lot of relationships in that, a lot of female relationships in Sex and the City. Am I right? And we see that in almost every show, someone has a bad situation. They said something wrong. They did something wrong. And someone steps up and says, I'm sorry. And maybe that's the simplest advice I would give to be able to mend that relationship.
That is great advice. And I have some advice to help prevent relationships from being broken. And that is, regardless of whether you think that people have the same politics as you, please do not talk politics these days, because half of your friends, believe it or not, probably do not think the way you do. And I have seen more relationships get broken forever due to politics. So please stop talking politics.
Well, I do think, though, that we've lost our ability to have public discourse, respectful disagreements, respectful debate. When I was in high school, we had a debate chapter and we worked on taking 2 points of view, but listening to each other and trying to find common ground. And I think just through circumstances, social media, we've done that. But I think Garry hit on a really, really important point for restoration, and that is forgiveness. Forgiveness is everything. And that's what you said, you would apologize. I guess for me, watching people suffer, as long as you're alive, keep trying. You may get rejected. You may have someone say, no way, but take every form of communication, whether it's phone, text, a letter, a video, just to express how much you love someone before it's too late. And I think that's what's hit home to me, is that life is short. You never know when you're going to get a diagnosis. I think mine is very positive, but there are other people that I saw in my treatment that they're not so fortunate, and my heart hurts for them. And so I think, Garry, you said you weren't sure if it was right. I think you're right. Forgiveness is everything in relationships.
Can I give some advice to the guys out there just for a minute?
Please.
Our situation is different. We don't think we need friends, and we think we have friends, but it actually turns out that our friends are really just the husbands of our wife's friends. We're going out tonight with our good friends. Well, my friend is the husband of her wife, and they're great friends, don't get me wrong. But in researching the book and saying that friendship is so important to happiness and longevity, I said, what am I going to do? And so it's so easy. I found one of my oldest friends. We were co-captains of the wrestling team in high school. I haven't talked to him in 50 years. I found him on Facebook. Thank God for social media. And I tracked him down and I just messaged him on Facebook. And this was 2 years ago. We have been talking ever since. He actually turns out that he wrote a book. His name is Mark. He wrote a book on Shakespeare. And it was almost like we were still best friends and nothing had changed except for the fact that everything had changed. In 50 years, everything has changed, but we picked up a relationship and kept going. And can I just give a shout out to guys who can do that? Not talk for 50 years, talk again and still be best friends. But we've got a lot of work to do on the male side of friendships, because I think we can do a better job. But, and you'd mentioned the connection between friendships and the blue zones. And that is one of the important 9 pillars that they have, a power of 9, where they have in Okinawa, they actually have these lifelong friends. There's a Japanese name. I can't remember it.
MOAI.
You have it. Okay. They choose 5 friends when they're young and they remain friends for their entire life. And I think to myself, what a cultural, beautiful thing to be able to do, to know that you're going to have this group that's going to support you your whole life. Because friendship and social relationships is so important to our happiness and our health. And believe it or not, our longevity. We live longer if we have a good tribe, and that's great to know.
Can you imagine trying to do the Moai here in the United States? It's the epitome of having your parents pick your friends.
Probably not. Probably not.
Well, but I do think that Garry hit on something. The Moai is because they're in proximity to each other and they live in the same community for generation after generation. In the United States, we are much more mobile, and yet we're a text, a phone call, an instant message away from connecting with people. And that's something that I know I've enjoyed, and I think you're doing too, Garry, is reaching into the past to people you haven't heard from a while, because in retirement, you have an opportunity, you have a little bit more time to work on those relationships. And for me, it's just so rewarding. Even though I've moved away from my community, I'm still in touch with people asking me to pray for them, be excited about when their grandkids accomplish things. And so there's a rich, rich life in retirement if you're willing to reach out. And somebody's got to be first. So if you're a listener here, take Garry's advice and make that phone call.
That's right. Be first.
Be first. I love it. I think this might be a great topic to finish up on. I'm not sure we can keep going with it if you want, but I have to tell you a quick story about going to my 50-year class reunion last year. I graduated with a class of 650 people in this class, big class. And I remained friends with maybe three. One was my stockbroker because he had to talk to me. And another one I saw twice a year at a hamburger stand. And the other one, we barely even talked to each other. And think about how us guys, that is what I consider my best three friends out of high school. So at the 50-year class reunion, we all got back together and many of us committed to staying in touch. And this has been a year now. And I will say a few of us have done a much, much better job of staying in touch with people who we went to school with 50 years ago. And it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing.
Now, how did you stay in touch? Do you do it on the phone? Do you text? Did you create a little Facebook group? How exactly did you do that?
So, you know what I do now? On Facebook, it tells you whose birthday it is, right? Everybody likes it or says happy birthday or whatever. I call them on their birthday, and I have to say, people are so appreciative to get the phone call versus the 25 to 30, likes or a happy birthday on Facebook, which I do anyway. And I think that it's still kind of fun to, get those. But just a short phone call is I'm finding to be the most rewarding.
Yeah, and then you actually get to talk with them, see and catch up and see how they're doing, right? Instead of just clicking a like on the Facebook. Great advice. Yeah, great advice.
Were there any other chapters that caught your attention?
Well, you probably don't want to talk about it, but it is relevant to me. I love the grumpy old man conversation. And I'm sure you don't want to talk about it, but I do. So here we go. It was so helpful to me, Garry, because my husband, his hip has been hurting. He just recently got diagnosed as diabetic, needs some cholesterol medicine. And I thought it was me. And started talking about, the changes that men go through, some of their testosterone levels. I think we get so caught up as women in our own issues with menopause and hormones. And I mean, it's a whole thing, as I'm sure you've experienced with your wife, hot flashes, night sweats. But I never really thought about what's going on for him physically and how is that affecting him mentally and emotionally. And that old adage of grumpy old men, it made me more empathetic to him. It made me a lot more compassionate to him. And so I know it probably wasn't your favorite conversation because the title is, stereotype, but I just wanted to let you know it helped me give a little bit more mercy and grace because I've been so focused on me that I wasn't realizing how he's struggling. And there's some really good biological reasons why. So thank you.
Probably one of the most rewarding things about writing this book is hearing from people like yourself. I get calls, I get texts, I get emails who said, thank you for this conversation, this chapter. This helped me in some way. I called my parents. I felt more in touch with my husband, or the many different things that I talk about that can help us in our aging process. I was inspired on writing that chapter, watching Attia with Tom Hanks, which of course is a great movie. And I asked my wife, am I a grumpy old man? And thank God she didn't answer, which she's so good about those things that she knows if I don't want to hear the answer, she's not going to give it. So it just sort of makes our life better. There is some science behind our grumpiness, but can I just say this? It doesn't happen with everyone. And I'm not speaking of myself. I'm probably grumpy, but my father turned into this mellow, nice, older gentleman. Now, granted, he was blessed with some wonderful health. He lived to be 95 years old and didn't take a pill in his life. And he was just blessed with a lot of good health. But he really mellowed in his later years, took care of my mom. She passed away 13 years before him, and he just became friends with everybody at his senior center and didn't experience it's actually called irritable male syndrome, IMS. It's actually got a scientific name, a medical name that you can say to yourself, oh, my husband's just going through IMS, right? I can just leave him alone. And the advice, by the way, to go get over the grumpy old man is sleep well, eat well, exercise, and stay connected. The same kinds of things that we do to stay healthy helps us with our grumpy old man syndrome.
Cool. Well, I know we don't want to end on grumpy old man, but there was one chapter that actually made me cry a little bit. It was Conversation 23, and it was your memories of metal cups. And I'll let you tell that story. But what it triggered for me was memories. And when I was a little girl, I had a great grandmother. She immigrated from Odessa, Russia. She was in her mid to late 80s when she finally just fell asleep and didn't wake up. But I remember her hands. And on her hands were these veins that stood really, really, really tall, kind of purple or whatever. And I just remember her hands. And then as my mom got older, she got the same hands, right? So my great grandma, my grandma, and now I'm looking at my own hands and I'm seeing the same veins and the same thing. And I just got really emotional because that chapter triggered the idea of memory and what you remember. And for me, it just wrapped the whole thing up in aging, right? That I was a child with my great grandma, my mom, we all have the same hands. And I'm assuming my granddaughter's going to see my hands and someday she'll be there. So sorry if I'm tearing up, but that whole give me those metal cups just really, really hit me. So maybe you could just share that story as we close.
And your story was wonderful. And you can look down at your hands and think about your mother and your grandmother every day. For me, when I was growing up, I drank out of a metal cup. And in the summertime, it was so wonderful because it kept my beverage at the time, water, pop, milk, very, very cold. And so I just loved those metal cups. And I would tell the story of the metal cups to my children. And they would get a lot of stories from me about my childhood. One Christmas, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, they got me some metal cups. Metal cups came back into my life. After 50 years of not having metal cups in my life, I now drink out of those metal cups every day, and I have two memories now. I have the memory of my childhood, and I now have the memory of my children giving me those metal cups. And can I just say that one of the most wonderful things about growing old is that we accumulate memories. And accumulating memories is like a great library. They tell a story, and the more memories we have, the larger our library is. And for me anyway, I don't keep bad books or bad memories, but I accumulate good ones. And I just are able to go back to them and think about those often. And something happens to me like a hot summer day and I think about my metal cups, I feel good and I smile. And for you, maybe you look down at your hands and you smile as well because it brings you some good memories. So memories are a great thing to have as we grow older, as we make the most of our retirement.
Wow, what a great way to end the show. Garry, thank you so much for coming on the show. Barbara, thank you for leading the interview process. And for the listeners, we'll see you next time on the Rock Your Retirement Show. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.